Welcome to this presentation on Grace Isabel Colbron, a life committed to changing the course of history through advocacy of the single tax doctrine. I'm Edward Dodson. In the October 1943 issue of the American Journal of Economics and Sociology, editor Will Listener provided a remembrance of Grace Isabel Colbron, who had died on the 8th of September after arriving to speak at the birthday anniversary of Henry George. He writes of her, "In New York and abroad, Grace Isabel Colbron was best known as an editor and translator of plays and novels. She had devoted the best part of a long and interesting life to belles lettres. Yet a social idealist to the depths of her soul, she was ready at any time to give of her best for any worthwhile project for social reform." The story of her life is, as Will Listener states, one of deep commitment to changing the course of history. She was born in New York City in 1869, was educated in private schools in New York City and Berlin. As a young woman, she left the United States for Berlin to embark on a career as a journalist, critic, and translator. One of her great abilities was the mastering of many languages, not only German, but those spoken in the Scandinavian countries. However, it was in New York City that she was first introduced to the teachings of Henry George by a single taxer named Lawson Purdy. She later wrote, "Having seen the light, the truth is taught by Henry George, I at once offered to serve in the way I could do best, that is, as a practiced speaker with a trained voice and the ability to face and hold an audience." Grace took on the role of translator of books into English, beginning with a collaboration with the Austrian author of crime fiction, Augusta Groner. Groner's first book appeared in 1890. She created the character of Detective Joseph Muller in The Case of the Pocket Diary Found in the Snow. Many more detective stories followed, and Grace remained as Augusta Groner's translator and collaborator. The first article by Grace to appear in a publication devoted to promotion of the single tax was in 1901, titled Military Ethics and Free Thought. This was published in the weekly newspaper The Public, edited by Louis F. Post. Her subject was the treatment of an Austrian novelist and playwright expelled from the Austrian army for ridiculing dueling in the most recent novel. Her next article in The Public reported on the activities of the German Single Tax Club. Most excellent work has been done by the association in instituting public inquiry into tenement house conditions, rent, etc. In Berlin, Hanover, Frankfurt on Main, Halle, and other prominent cities, the association has aroused the municipal authorities into taking legislative action to restrict speculation in land. This report appeared in the October 12 issue. The next month, she wrote about the efforts of progressive German women to make their voices heard. Dr. Anita Augsburg, a prominent member of the Committee of the Congress of Progressive Women's Clubs, argued against the absurd and antiquated German coalition laws which demand the presence of police at every public meeting and which prohibit the political clubs from taking women members, as well as allowing women to join in a political debate. Grace's career commitments apparently kept her from making any contributions to the Public or other single tax publications during 1902. But in January of 1903, she reviewed Adolph de Moss' book Land Reform. De Moss has not attempted to give a complete history of the movement. He has gathered into book form a series of 8 lectures given by him in Berlin and other towns, in which the theory is explained and an account of its progress offered in a way to interest hearers of the spoken word, particularly as the speaker is anxious to win over to his views. She next wrote on the child labor question. "Wrongs done to little children touch every heart. The parent instinct of love and protection towards children is as strong in the heart of the father and mother of poverty as in parents of the more favored class. Where the feeling appears to be lacking, it is due to individual depravity, or to the stunting of every faculty, every good instinct, by generations of grinding toil, which has brought neither the means nor the leisure for the satisfaction of any but the most necessary animal needs. She continues to report on the events in Germany. Adolf Damas' book Land Reform, published last fall, is still receiving much attention and selling excellently. Another important work on political economy is attracting attention in Germany. This is Dr. B. Friedlander's The Four Chief Currents of the Modern Social Movement. Dr. Friedlander gives a most excellent comparison of the nebulous, unscientific arguments of Marx with the clear, logical, and lucid doctrines of Henry George. In an article appearing in the 15 October 1904 issue of The Public, Grace urged women to become far more active in the struggle against imperialism and war. She writes, "If women would stop weeping over the silent upturned fair and admiring the outer trappings that mark the licensed murderer, long enough to think a little about the connection between the two, the cause of peace would take a 7-league stride onward." In October of 1904, Grace attended the 14th annual convention of the German Land Reform League, which took place in Darmstadt, a little city in southern Germany. Over 100 delegates attended. Karl Marfels, vice president of the league, opened the conference. He stated, "The task which the League of German Land Reformers has set itself is the most important, in fact the most fundamental one. The League recognizes that all our progress, all improvements, all advance of civilization has had for main effect the heaping up of incomes from property in land for a small minority, and it desires, through a proper taxation of the enormous sums drawn from land values every year to the harm of the workers, to turn these incomes to that source. From this they spring to the community." Already, Grace was establishing herself as a reviewer of books, the review of Adolf Damas' Land Reform being the first of many she would write over the next 4 decades. Grace's commitment to the promotion of the single tax doctrine did not diminish her productive output elsewhere. An article entitled "Dance and Pantomime" appeared in the August 1904 issue of the Cosmopolitan. She writes, "The oldest of all the arts has become the stepchild of art, alternatively exalted and reviled, expressive of religious ecstasy or of wanton lust, expressive also of personal pleasure or of perfected toil for the pleasure of others. Thus the art of dancing has come down the centuries." In the summer 1905 issue of the Single Tax Review, Grace provided a thoughtful analysis of the history of radicalism in literature. I found it quite difficult to choose the following brief excerpts. Even today, what she wrote on the subject deserves our consideration. While the daily routine of life, that part of man's work and interest impelled by hunger, which includes every means of seeking a livelihood and incidentally all the work of the world, while this daily routine was rough and rude and brutal, unrelieved by variety or invention, it was around the love impulse that all the finer things of life gathered, all its beauty, its refinement, its daintiness. Civilized man considered that he had gone a tremendous step forward along the line of progress when he had clothed the crude satisfying of his hunger in a more refined and dainty way of getting his food, and still further, when he cloaked the basic impulse in all the complication of the modern economic system. His self-satisfaction led him to think that he was progressing in the right direction, and that all the advance necessary lay along the same lines, to refine still further the manner of getting food, to to complicate still more the economic process. But every now and then, some poet-teacher has suggested that a little justice in the distribution would be good, that refinement did not mean all it should, if it were to remain the property of the few. At some point during these first years of the 20th century, Grace became a member of the Manhattan Single Tax Club. At the same time, she was lecturing extensively throughout Central Europe. Grace held deep concerns regarding the injustices imposed on women and other minorities. In 1908, a new play titled The Servant in the House depicted, quote, the doctrine of a church founded on brotherly love, of a religion of justice, and inculcated hatred of worldliness, of selfishness, of greed masquerading in the name of goodness. Grace noted in the January-February 1909 issue of the Single Tax Review that it was the socialists rather than the single taxers who made use of this media to reach a large audience with their message. Grace pointed to the attitude of women in the single tax movement in particular. There are many of us who will have nothing to do with that which does not bear the party label. The worst sinners in this respect are the women, and it is to them as a woman to women having a common bond of faith that I would speak here. So many of them might be such a power for good were it not for this ghost of a name, which keeps them back from a logical realization of what single tax really means. When other women come to us and want us to agitate for anything from child labor legislation down to soup kitchens and anti-cigarette laws, we ought to show them the fallacy of all such palliative measures and the usefulness of a fundamental understanding of economic principles. We should refuse to be swept away by any emotional wave of momentary superficial reform and stand firm on the comprehension of what is basic. In the March-April 1912 issue of the Single Tax Review, the editors provided readers with a brief profile of Grace. Miss Grace Isabel Colbron, who is known to single taxers all over this land and who is a graceful and effective speaker for the cause, is also a playwright, critic, and reader whose work in these lines has made her known in other circles. Her work on the Bookman and her book reviews in the various literary periodicals have been admirably discriminating and marked by character and distinction. As a translator, she has also done notable work, having to her credit translations of Comte's Coquette, from the Italian of Bracco and The Fair Tale, from the German of Schnitzler for Nazimova and Happiness in a Corner, from the German of Sudermann, played by the Donald Robertson Players. She has genuine talent as an actress and dramatic reader, and is an untiring worker in many fields. From her duties, she has nevertheless borrowed sufficient time to contribute of her splendid talents and magnificent energy to the cause of industrial emancipation through the single tax, in the principles and details of which she is as well informed as any man or woman in the movement. In 1912, Grace also contributed to the Single Tax Review a long article describing the ongoing land reform efforts in Germany, where, quote, Bowden reformers look to the community as their chief field of work. Pictured here is a printed version of a lecture delivered in 1914 by a Dr. Vogel on land reform. Now, however, the urgency of the moment required every effort to restore peace. In the 1 January 1915 issue of The Advocacy of Peace, Grace wrote on behalf of the Women's Single Tax League. If the working men refuse to fight, and refuse in peace times to prepare to fight, if he refused to contribute in any way toward the cost of armaments, and if women, even where not enfranchised, will realize that the trappings that mark the man training to keep his fellows should be a bait of shame and not one of glory, the powers that be, resting their supremacy on armed force, would find that armed force a thing of the past. Then they might look about for the possibility of a change in economic conditions that would make force unnecessary. As a single taxer, I am working for the bringing about of such conditions, but I am beginning to think that talking to the present-day world about it is like lecturing to a boy with a gun in his hand. It is splendid to enlighten him as to the evil of the doctrine of force and hatred, and to make him see that the natural, the divine law of the universe is love, but it's a lot safer to take the gun away from him first. You get on with your teaching much better, and present-day human nature has to be shamed into laying down its gun. That seems to be the only way to go. During 1916, Grace reported on the findings of the Committee on Taxation of New York City. Various single taxers had given testimony in support of exempting property improvements from taxation. I have not been able to find any details about her activities during the First World War. She contributed only a few more articles to the public after the first months of 1917 until the public's closing in 1919. This photograph of Grace was taken at her attendance of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, held on the 7th of May, 1920. The Women's International League for Peace and Freedom had been founded in 1915 in response to the outbreak of war. In 1915, over 1,100 members met in The Hague, quote, with a goal to develop mediation strategies to end the war and ultimately eradicate the root causes of war. To what extent Grace played a role in the resolutions adopted by this conference, there is no record. However, on the subject of commerce and investments, the resolutions read as follows. A. The International Congress of Women urges that in all countries there shall be liberty of commerce, that the sea shall be free and the trade routes open on equal terms to the shipping of all nations. B. Inasmuch as the investments by capitalists of one country in the resources of another and the claims arising therefrom are a fertile source of international complications, this International Congress of Women urges the widest possible acceptance of the principle that such investments shall be made at the risk of the investor without claims to the official protection of his government. In 1924, Grace attended a conference in Denmark held under the auspices of the Henry George Association to discuss a new land value tax bill then before the Danish Parliament. Rather remarkably, all of the land in Denmark had undergone a valuation during 1915. At the 1926 International Conference of Single Taxers held in Denmark, Grace offered her own perspectives on the prospects for reform in Denmark. The Georgist movement in Denmark, from the composition of its adherents and from the nature of the people, is of the greatest possible value to the movement everywhere. Denmark would be the ideal center of any movement for an international union, as the Danes are the only really internationally minded people I know. They have no imperialistic ambitions, and they are setting the whole world an example of sane nationalism, which means merely setting one's own house in order while keeping an open mind for whatever the rest of the world has to offer. Single taxers in the United States now sought Grace's involvement in the movement's organizations. She was invited to join the advisory committee of the Henry George Foundation of America. In November of 1926, the Commonwealth Land Party's New York members honored her with a dinner where Grace reported on the international conference. At the 1927 Henry George Congress held in New York City in September, Grace challenged orthodox thinking with an address on sex and economics. About prostitution, she told her audience, "The question of prostitution today is solely an economic question. There is no woman offering herself on the streets of our towns today who is doing it for any other reason than that of economic need. This I assert and stand by. I do not deny that there are women as little monogamous by nature as are some men. I know that there are quite a number of women absolutely wanton by nature. But unless these women are absolutely poor, they are not on the streets. The divorce courts see them often. At the 1928 Henry George Congress, she delivered a paper on, quote, employment and poverty. She attended the next two Congresses and in 1932 served on the advisory committee for the founding of the Henry George School of Social Science. Then in 1935, she was elected to the board of the Henry George Foundation of America. Upon the death of Joseph Dana Miller, the longtime editor of the Single Tax Review and Land and Freedom, Grace took the opportunity to reflect on decades of writing on behalf of the single tax. The position of editor, for whom professional writers are expected to work for nothing, is not an easy one. I have often wondered whether the comrades who were not writers by profession really understood how difficult Joseph Miller's position was and how well he carried it off. Of course, we professionals who contributed for no monetary returns to his magazine were all working, as he himself was, for the cause in which we believed, and it was a pleasure to work for his magazine, for he kept up its standard in his devotion to the cause for which his magazine stood. The Single Tax Review and its later incarnation as Land and Freedom formed an excellent, valuable, and necessary companion to magazines like The Public, for many years so valiant a fighter for justice and liberty, so actively in touch with all effort along the line of work for fundamental economics. This image of Grace appeared in the May 1941 issue of The Freeman, along with a brief biographical sketch of her life. Of her personal life outside of her professional work, I have found almost nothing. During the Second World War, Grace made valiant attempts to learn about the situation of European single taxers. She reported that the Danes were continuing to meet and hold classes, quote, in spite of all the troubles that brave little country is suffering under. Her final article, Denmark Carries On, appeared in the August 1943 issue of The Freeman. Grace died on the 8th of September, shortly after arriving in Delaware to speak at the birthday anniversary celebration of Henry George. Thank you.